Now, we are moving to the second part of the program with the first keynote speech to be given by Professor Jon Lang. He is a professor of architecture at the University of the New South Wales in Sydney. He is the author of the seminal books of Design and Urbanism, Creating Architectural Theory, The Role of the Behavioral Sciences in Environmental Design, Urban Design, The American Experience, Urban Design, A Typology of Procedures and Products are the ones which have already been the reference texts in the literature. I kindly invite Professor Jon Lang to the floor.
I'm delighted to be here and honored that you should invite me. A couple of brief comments before I start. I know I have an unusual accent, and I hope that you can understand me clearly. The attendants on the flight here had difficulty with my English. My first language was, in fact, Hindi, and subsequently I've lived in a number of places, which accounts for that. My presentation includes a number of slides, and many of them have substantial text on them. I'm not planning to read that. I think you can read it faster than I can talk, and I'd simply like to bring your attention to some of the major points. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about urban design as it is now and the conflicts in thinking about what kinds of designs are good designs. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about trends and where we might be going. And finally, I'd like to end up by talking very briefly about architectural and urban design education. Some definitions. To me, urban design is project design. And in this way, I conflict with my colleague, Alexander Cuthbert, who regards urban design as the political economy of cities. And I recognize the importance of understanding how project design fits into the dynamics of urban development and growth. But nevertheless, I stick with the definition that comes from Lewis Mumford and Clarence Stein, and then picked up by Jose Luis Sert. I'll talk a little bit about paradigms, and I also want to talk about generic solutions. Today, there's a variety of urban design programs around the world, located in different departments within the university. We have a literature, and in many ways, we're becoming like a discipline in its own right. In 2005, I drew this diagram, and I suggested that we had this choice as urban designers and thinking about the future. Do we want to become something independent, or do we simply want to be an integrative group of people working within traditional design disciplines? And I said at that time that I didn't really want urban design to become a discipline in its own right, but rather to remain a collaborative activity. But my perception is that we are, in fact, moving to become a discipline in our own right. The conflict is that now the various departments, city planning wants to say, oh no, urban design is ours. Architecture wants to say urban design is ours. And landscape architecture always seems to be so ambivalent, but nevertheless they want to claim urban design as their own. So this is the issue. Do we want to become a discipline in our own right, or do we want to continue as a collaborative activity? I've been fascinated by these two designs. I was actually chairman of the jury for this design competition, and they represent two very different ideas about what urban design should be, the vision that we have. And when I'm talking to students, they all want the design on the left because that is modern and it is forward-looking, whereas the design on the right, which was designed by Marina Khoury, who's of Lebanese origin, starts to deal with issues of climate and culture. And so we have this question about what identity do we want to have? Do we want to be identified with the modern globalizing world, or do we want to retain an interest in local identity? And so the design is really quite a thoughtful design in dealing with the climate and with the culture. The RTKL design out of their Hong Kong office really deals with the global world that we inhabit. So these two designs represent two different types of search for identity in the world. My prediction is that these two attitudes towards urban design will persist into the future. The question is, should it be so? Should we be doing something different? Should we be trying to be global and local at the same time? Which a number of people have called for. Where do we go from here? The future is unknown, but we can make some sensible predictions about it. I'll be a little cautious about this because when I joined the staff at the University of Pennsylvania in 1970, I was asked to give a brief presentation on the future of architecture, which I did. And that's 1970. I gave the same talk again in 2005 at the Institute of Architects in Sydney. And people said, well, why haven't things happened? And I quoted Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, who was asked shortly before his death, why haven't all the predictions that you made come true? And he said, they're going to come true. So that's still a position. A general observation about the speed of change. Many of our architectural ideas and urban design ideas still stem from the beginning of the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century. And this isn't surprising because in the first half of the 20th century, the world really got turned upside down. And technically, my grandfather did not believe that the Wright brothers had actually flown a plane. He saw the moon landing in 1969. No telephone to telephone, no television to television, no movies to movies. To Fantasia, which came out in the year that I was born, 1938. So tremendous change and social change. And one of the big inventions of that part of the century was you and I. Okay? The academic world and the students, mass education, and so on. What kinds of changes are taking place now? To me, the major change is the growth in population, simply astronomical change. And the anecdote that I give as an example is that in 1961, a friend from Zimbabwe and I went to Stonehenge on a Sunday. And there were 4 people there, he and I, and a very famous Hollywood couple, Rod Steiger and Claire Bloom, and nobody else. And we walked amongst the stones and then caught a bus and went home. And today, if you go there, everything is now, you have parking and you can't go amongst the stones and so on. Tremendous change. But other technical changes, we talk about automobiles and changes in the way that we move around. What impact will they have? And there's also tremendous cultural shifts and people pushing in different directions. So what impact will the car have? We can make some predictions as how it might affect the form of cities, but when I look back to the city of 1960 or 1970, it really isn't that different to what we have today. And my prediction is that the city of in 25 years will probably be very similar to us, to the one that we have right now. Let's consider some of these changes by a particular approach to thinking about types of urban design. And I know that most of us feel more comfortable in talking about different types of projects, central business districts. So we'd like to compare maybe La Défense with Canary Wharf, with Pudong in Shanghai, with Naples and what they're trying to do. But I find it more useful to talk in terms of how one implements design, whether it's all done by one firm, total urban design, whether we're developing conceptual designs and shape those designs by the guidelines that we write, or whether we talk about urban design as public policy, or we talk about infrastructure design as a catalyst for development. And so in terms of total urban design, here are two very, very different schemes. The first is the Empire State Mall in Albany, New York. Albany is the state capital of New York. And the second is a scheme which is presently in progress in Edinburgh in Scotland. The first scheme has been much maligned, I think perhaps over-criticized, but is nevertheless a very bold statement. And the second one, by Foster Associates, is much more of an infill type project and focuses on the street. And I see this is the major shift in concern. And I would argue that if we get the streets right in urban design, we'll do well. But we also see massive developments like this. And so one of the things that I think we need to start learning how to do is to design high-density environments which are not overcrowded. And by not being overcrowded, I mean that they have the range of behavior settings appropriate to the size of population, so that people are participants in life and not people who are pushed aside. Where should we be going? We need to develop a variety of new paradigms, it seems to me, that we're still stuck on the paradigms that were developed in the first part of the 20th century, with minor changes over time. I think that the real dilemma is how do we deal with individual rights and the rights of architects and developers to do their own thing, because both are prima donnas, and the rights of the public interest. But this is a very tricky issue. What is the public interest, and who defines the public interest? And this has been a subject of much debate over the time. The implications are that the newer paradigms must be developer-friendly, that we tend to see a competition between planning and development, but then in fact, without developers and people who are wanting to create new futures, urban design just simply would not exist. So it's a collaborative art between development and design. And so we turn on to all of the peace design. The one on the left for New Chinatown, or the Chinatown extension in Philadelphia, is an example. I don't know how many individual projects there are within this whole scheme. I should have counted them, but there are 5 or 6, 7, 8 different areas which are part of the project. The only part that's really gone ahead has been the area on the right, partly because the constraints were so high that there was very little else you could do. But one of the objectives of this development was for the middle class Chinese Americans living in Chinatown to have an alternative to the suburban life, so that they retain an identity in Chinatown. Whether this is a good or a poor goal is open to question, but nevertheless, goals of design are always political in nature. Implementing them really relies on our use of the knowledge that we have to link goals with designs. The one on the right is a current project which is underway, but is essentially the same in character. A large number of different developers and architects working collaboratively. And so they have these different types of guidelines. Some are very prescriptive. I've always been an arguer for performance guidelines, but most developers prefer to be told exactly what to do, what they can't do, rather than to try to work out whether their designs meet particular proposals or not. This is a current design which fascinates me. The urban designer was Moshe Safdie, and is really very different from some of the work that he's been doing in Singapore, for instance, and I admire his dexterity, mental dexterity in dealing with very different situations. He, in fact, is not the architect. He's designed one building in this whole complex, and the design guidelines were prescriptive, but there weren't many of them. But what has happened has been that the designers have been working with a sense of decorum, and by that I mean that they have a respect for what other people are doing, what other designers are doing. And so although this looks like it was all designed by one hand, in fact, there are many, many hands involved. The actual location of this particular new town is open to dispute, but nevertheless, I think it's a fascinating example of collaboration amongst different developers and different architects working with very few guidelines. And this is another scheme that I've been following for some years now, the development of the new CBD, I guess, of Shanghai. And the illustration on top is the intended skyline. Now, one of the things that happens in urban design is that your client shifts. So as the client, in this case, the city administration of Shanghai has shifted, so their attitude has shifted. At one stage, they wanted tall buildings, but there was a restriction on how high they should be. But now the attitude is the taller you can build a building, the better it is. And so you can see the effect of some of the original guidelines on the profile of this development, but you can also see where it has been, well, they have been disregarded. So you get these opposing attitudes towards urban design as piece-by-piece design, or by all-of-a-piece design. One is the statement by Rob Creer, where he argues for strong guidelines to create cohesive design. On the other hand, you get Daniel Libeskind saying, well, we live in a different world. We live in a competitive world. We live in a world of individualism, and the city should reflect this. And we don't want another Rockefeller Center, but whenever I go to New York, I end up sooner or later in Rockefeller Center, and it's a very lively place and has worked out very well. Whether one considers the Rockefeller Center as a total urban design or as all-of-a-piece urban design is open to question, because a group of architects were working so closely together, it was almost like one team. Well, where do we go from here? My suspicion is that the demand for and against design controls will follow a curve. That one stage we go for everybody doing their own thing, and we look at the world and say, that's not the way we want it, we should put in more guidelines, and then people will say, oh, but you're stifling innovation, we should abandon the guidelines, and so on. And in general, the architectural profession, and I hope I'm not maligning it, is against guidelines. They're wanting innovation, but when I look at some of the innovations that are being suggested around the world, I wonder whether that's the type of environment that we want to inhabit. And the other thing that is a major factor is the economic conditions of a city at a particular time. So when the city of New York was going broke, they were going for development at any cost almost in order to raise the tax base. And it's very difficult for a city which is going through tough times to say, no, no, you can't do that. You have to do it in a particular fashion. And so if you take La Défense in Paris, it's really quite fascinating to look at the history and look at the degree of control over what is being built over time. My position is that, if you really deal with the street and the way buildings meet the street and what the ground floor of the environment is, that by and large you can do almost anything architecturally. Unless you really want to create, unless the political will is to create a local sense of place or an abandonment of a local sense of place, then I think we really have to have guidelines for aesthetics. And plug-in urban design really deals with infrastructure, and one of the questions is, what are the infrastructural changes that are likely to be taking place that will affect urban form? And it's very difficult to predict into the future. But we've used museums as catalysts for change quite extensively. Schools have been used in a number of places to upgrade an area. Building new public open spaces in another way, and a variety of other mechanisms. And so here are two examples. And these two examples fascinate me because they were pushed by one individual, which shows that if you have a strong idea which makes sense and which can be communicated to the public, it can create substantial changes. The first is the Skyway system in Minneapolis. There are many, many subterranean pedestrian systems around the world as well. But this is where buildings are linked at what we in Australia and in Britain would call the first floor level, in America the second floor level. And you have to remember that Minneapolis has a temperature range from -35 to +35 over the course of the year, and it creates a very comfortable environment in which to move around. The question is, what effect does this have on the ground floor of cities? And that has not been all that positive. The one on the right was essentially a potential of being an open sewer, and it's been turned into a very, very attractive river walk, Paseo del Rio, and is a major tourist attraction in San Antonio, Texas, and in fact outdraws the Alamo as a destination. Question is, what new infrastructure systems will be put in place? We talk about smart cities. What effect will that have? We talk about mechanization on an increasing scale, solar infrastructure. What is happening? What will we grab and run with, and what is a fad at a particular point in time and will die? Where should we be going? We must learn to design with change in mind, and that's not that easy. One of the questions that students hate being asked in juries is, how easy would it be to demolish your building? And so on. So dealing with changes is not that easy. Urban design as public policy has fascinated me, and in this way, I, like many other people, have been very influenced by Jonathan Barnett. And the question is, if we look at our history of trying to design by public policy, that many of the public policies that we put into place have had effects that we did not predict, because we did not really test those ideas. And the open space program in New York City is a very good example of that the large number of plazas that have been created is wonderful, but only about a quarter of them serve any useful purpose. I've been, again, fascinated by this little example in Singapore, Little India, and very, very strong guidelines for development. And the guidelines have to do with use of buildings, but also with how you handle the 5-foot walkways, which are characteristic of Singapore, how you deal with roof line, et cetera, et cetera. Very rigid, prescriptive design guidelines. And it's had a tremendous positive effect in maintaining the physical nature of the area. But it's also had an effect of changing an area which was fairly mixed in population. It included Tamils, included Anglo-Chinese, and minorities of Malays and Chinese ethnics. Now it has become an almost entirely Tamil area, which doesn't worry me, but is actually opposed to the integrative ethnic policy of Singapore. So we do things with one intention, and it has side effects which were not anticipated. And one of the things that I think we need to do is to really test these public policies on the drawing board or on the computer screen before putting them into place. So that in a studio I might say to students, okay, here are the guidelines, do the worst design that you can within these guidelines, and then let's see, how would you change the guidelines to make the worst case scenario impossible to implement? So this is what I believe we need to do there. Let's switch directions a little bit and look at the design process. I have been a strong advocate throughout my educational career and through the time that I've been dealing with educating others for a problem-solving, evidence-based approach to design. And I've been told repeatedly repeatedly, that's fine and you're right, but nobody wants to work that way. That we work from generic ideas and so on. That we work from examples. So we have this particular example, and then we say, why can't we have that? So that if you take La Défense in Paris, Margaret Thatcher visited and said, okay, we want one of those for London. The president of China visited, we want one of those for Shanghai, etc., etc. And as some of you know, I have a continued connection with the land of my birth, although I'm not ethnically Indian, with India. And this kind of design fascinates me. This is both of them done by a Shanghai firm, one for the Pudong area in Shanghai itself, and one for Ahmedabad in India. The cultural and climatic conditions are totally different, and yet we take the design from one place and we put it down in another. And this is an example in India itself of work by one of India's leading architects, taking an example from the Thar Desert and then applying it in a monsoon climate area. And I was very pleasantly surprised that I was at the inaugural Cyrus Jabwala lecture in New Delhi earlier this year, which was presented by Raj Raval. And he presented the scheme, and he said, I really messed it up. And I very seldom hear an architect talking about their own work and saying, I really made an error of judgment in this design. The past was well and good when it was with us. It is the future that beckons us now. And so a lot of people say we want to get rid of the shackles of the past and look to the future. But we have to be very careful about that. Where should we be going? I would like us, as a community of scholars and professionals, to really think about new paradigms, new ways of looking at the world, and new ways of designing. And I think for urban design to develop as a discipline, it really has to start thinking in much greater detail about what works and what does not work in what circumstance, and learning from that. And again, a couple of schemes which have fascinated me. Are these really generic designs for arid climate Islamic cities? It's surprising that they're done approximately at the same time, and they have a remarkable overlap. They are, after all, responding to the same situation. An observation: things will not change as rapidly as we expect, but I still worry about a number of things. I worry about people getting so fascinated with new technologies that they will forget about issues of quality of life for the citizens of a particular place and visitors to a particular place. I often say in a half-hearted way that what we should be designing for are children and for birds. If we get that right, then everything else will fall into place. But that's a simplification. But one of the things that I do worry about is the loss of individual mobility for children in cities. That I can see that over my lifetime, and people who are of the previous generation to me can see it even more dramatically over their lifetimes. In summary, where should we be going? We need to develop an evidence-based approach to design. At the same time, if we're unwilling to work that way, then we need new paradigms and new generic solutions. What is the role of the urban designer in all this? First of all, I think we have an educated role, that we really need to understand how things work and don't work, and to bring people's attention to what possibilities exist. And this isn't always easy. In the Chinatown example that I showed you earlier, one of the central features is a little Catholic school, and which was always having financial difficulty. We showed the nuns who ran the school how that they may make a profitable transition in the design of the school to make it a profitable institution. And we hired a bus and we got the nuns to come with us and we showed them all kinds of possibilities. And they simply said, well, that's all very interesting, we just don't want to change. And so, nevertheless, we have this educative role. And at the same time, we have to be willing to stick our necks out and design under uncertainty. And so, yes, I think that we can talk about things, but ultimately, we have to take that pencil in our hands and we have to draw what we mean. And the transition from words to design is often a very difficult one. There's still two groups. Those of us who are dreamers and thinking of ideal worlds, and those who are much more pragmatic and say, okay, these things work, let's do it again. The first group is most closely associated with the Napoleonic Code in Europe, and the second group much more closely related with English common law and the descendants of English common law, which is still the basis of the legal system of the United States and countries such as Australia and some other places a little bit more mixed. We somehow have to merge thinking about, dreaming about the future with the realities of who we are. And one of the big challenges, I think, for urban design is to not only worry about the middle class and the wealthy, and to worry about the everyday citizen, and also about people who are generally forgotten in the work that we do. And it's interesting that in China, in Shanghai, there's a tremendous effort now in the Pudong area to make it much more friendly for pedestrians. A lot of these issues should have been thought about up front, but now we're reworking the scheme. And the same with La Défense in Paris, and to a lesser extent, Canary Wharf in London. What does this mean for the education of urban designers? Within the last 6 months, a former student at the University of Pennsylvania sent me a manuscript that he'd written, which I thought was a very thoughtful work. But at the same time, he was complaining that the world wasn't like the studio at Penn. And I thought, well, maybe we should be really thinking the other way around. Why wasn't the studio at Penn dealing with the issues of the real world? And I can understand the traditional studio, and I teach them. But at the same time, we need to get students to have a real feeling for the dynamics of problem solving, of designing within the political and economic world that we inhabit. And the only way that I can perceive of doing that is through the case studies. And I'm reminded of a little seminar that was held in Puerto Rico some years ago. It was invited, and there were people like Moshe Safdie was there, Denise Scott Brown, Robert Gutman from Princeton, Jonathan Barnett, Dennis Ryan from Washington, and I. And during it, I made an argument for the studio-based education, and Jonathan Barnett made an argument for a case studies-based approach to education, which made me really sit up and think. And so I really tried to incorporate case studies into the educational programs that I've been involved with. The dilemma is that we have very few serious case studies in urban design. And if you look at the architectural record case studies, they really don't tell us very much about how decisions were made. And so we really need case studies which are comparable to those taught in the Kennedy School or the Wharton School and the big business schools around the world. And so I would argue that somehow we need to amalgamate the studio with understanding of the dynamics of decision making. A final observation, we have many, many fine empirical studies, and there'll be a number presented here. I've followed the Environmental Design Research Association's conferences, which I think are number 46 or 47 now, from the very first one which I attended. Lovely studies, beautifully designed, and so on. But then the question is, so what? What do they amount to? And we need to think of the bigger scale of integrating empirical information into design. But the real question is, what do you think? And I look at the audience and I say, well, some of you are probably going to be working in 2050, maybe even 2060. And so you have your careers ahead of you. I have maybe another 5 years, if I'm lucky, or maybe 10 years of being involved in urban design. But it's ultimately you who have to take the field forward. And no doubt there'll be a lot of infighting and so on, but that is not something to be regretted, so long as it's done in a civilized fashion. So what I've tried to do is present you some thoughts about where we are, where we might be going, and where, in reflection on my own career, where we should be going. So thank you very much for being listening to me and being courteous. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lang, for your inspiring